Hi YouTube, this is Raven. I'm a survivor of a 16-year marriage to a covert narcissist, and now I'm in a high-conflict divorce from a covert narcissist. And I was watching a video the other day by Narcissist Free. She has a great channel, like hundreds of videos on, and a lot of great information, Narcissist Free. And she was talking about, counseling with a narcissist and how never go to counseling with a narcissist. And, she is completely correct on that. Marriage counseling with my narcissist was a complete waste of time. I mean, it really was. It was a waste of my time, the counselor's time. I don't know about his time because he loved theater, and, counseling for narcissists it's all about theater. Because, the stage is set, they're on stage, they've got a willing audience, and they're going to sit there and portray you as the problem. You're the problem, they're the victim, they're the hero of their story. And that's pretty much what happened in our marriage counseling. And we went to marriage counseling about 6 months before his attempted suicide. It was actually a manipulation tactic. That was another theater where he put a gun in his mouth and, pretended he was going to blow his head off, and then he ended up in the mental hospital, and, that was more theater because he had more, medical professionals to listen to his story. But, about 6 months before this attempted suicide, he was very, very depressed, or he was acting depressed. And I used to feel like I was married to an old man because he was grumpy all the time. I used to say he had PMS, he had pissy male syndrome. And, he was just yelling and screaming at the kids, and, he wouldn't talk to me. He would lock himself away in his office for hours playing video games. I know now that's the silent treatment. It's how narcs devalue you. They just won't talk to you. They won't communicate. And, he announced, that he was depressed and he needed to go on testosterone because I have low testosterone and that's why I'm depressed. So he goes to the doctor, and the doctor gives him a prescription. It's like $150 a month for this testosterone that he rubs on his shoulder. And the testosterone actually made him worse. It did not make him better. It did not make him happier. It just made him worse. And he declared, after about a month of this, we need to go to marriage counseling. Our marriage is in trouble. And, I was thinking, well, our marriage has been in trouble for several years because, you treat me like a jerk and you treat the kids like a jerk. So, yeah, I kind of agree. And, he was going to make an appointment. But, he always made these declarations, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But then, he never followed through. And, so, of course, he didn't make the appointment. And, I was going to see a counselor at the time. And she said, well, I do marriage counseling. Why don't you, have him, come here for a session. And so I suggest that to him, and he's like, oh yes, that's a good idea. I'll go with you to your counselor. Well, when the appointment came up, he chickened out. He didn't go. And I think it's because he knew that he couldn't spin his story because this counselor had worked with me for 1.5 years. So, she knew me. So he wasn't going to be able to get in there and get on stage and she's the problem, she's the problem, she's the problem. He couldn't do that. So then he finally made an appointment with a counselor of his choosing. And that's number one. Don't ever, even if you decide to go to counseling, especially marriage counseling with a narcissist, don't let them pick the counselor. Don't. But, I didn't know it was a narc, and so he picked the counselor. And, the first counseling session, he didn't even tell me that we had a counseling session. He sent me a Google Evite. He's sitting on one end of the couch and I'm on the other. And he sends me a Google Evite, counseling tomorrow at 9. I'm like, what? And he's sitting there saying, I already told you about this. And I think what he meant was that, I had a job where I worked from home, and it's production. I type ER reports. And I'm paid by the line, so I can't just get up from my desk and because, I also have to produce a certain amount of lines per hour or I'll get fired because, my production goes down. So, he would wait when there was something important he needed to talk to me about. He would wait until, I'm typing and I'm working and I'm trying to concentrate on this patient's chart. And he's like, I need to spend $150 on something, And then, I'd be like, what? Okay, whatever. And then he would go out and then, spend the money, and then he would come back and it's like, well, you told me I could, So I'd asked him, please don't share things like that with me. Don't ask me questions while I'm working, wait until I'm done. So I'm sure that he had probably told me at some point that we had a counseling session, but, he waited to do it when I was distracted, with work. So, we get to this counseling session, and, the counselor's like, so tell me why you are here. And he goes very theatrically, we don't communicate at all. Our marriage is in trouble. We don't communicate. Just like that. And the counselor's like, okay, why don't you elaborate? And so I elaborated. And I'm like, well, he never talks to me, yells and screams at the kids. I didn't even know we had this counseling session until I got the Google Evite. So yeah, we don't communicate. Well, then he spends the next 90 minutes of this counseling session just dominating the counseling session, talking about, she does this and she does that and she does this. And I'm, this poor husband who's just beat down and belittled and, henpecked. And, he was describing, if you've ever seen the movie Norbert with Eddie Murphy, and he was basically describing me as Rasputia, this big, fat, manipulative bitch, basically, who just beats down on poor Norbert. And I was like, whoa, that's not me. I'm not a yeller. I'm not a screamer. I don't do these things. And every time I tried to interrupt, she would lean forward and she would tap my knee. Let him speak. Let him speak. I was like, let him speak. He's been speaking for 90 minutes. Like it's not like he's repressed. Now let him speak. Let him get this out. It's been in him for so long. I was like, no, it's not. Does this look like a repressed individual to you? So, it went on, and he went on to say things like, if I don't have dinner ready at 5:30 exactly, there's going to be hell to pay. She makes me cook dinner every night. Well, I didn't make him cook dinner. It's like he volunteered to cook dinner because I had a second shift job, and I couldn't leave my job to go cook dinner. And so, he would cook dinner. But, then he's making me pay for it later because, our dinners were always very, very stressful because he was very controlling and manipulative when it came to the children and what they ate. And he was count out their tater tots. They can only have a certain amount of tater tots, a certain amount of vegetables. If they weren't eating their vegetables, he was just in their face like, you will not leave this table until you eat all those vegetables. If you don't eat them, you're going to go to bed hungry. And so every night I was like, can we just have one night that's like no yelling? Can we just have like a nice family dinner? But that, never happened, But, so he's describing me as the person who's doing all these things. And, we go to about 3 sessions. And finally on the 3rd session, I think she'd finally figured it out. And, she leans forward. I think that you are communicating with a version of your wife that isn't real. You see your relationships with all women through the lens of your abusive mother. And, because of the trauma in your childhood, you're reacting and acting with her this way. You've built up a false version of Raven in your head. And, I think she was right about that because he described these mental gymnastics that he did where he would think over and over in his head, 100 times before he ever spoke to someone, okay, I'm going to say this, they're going to say this, I'm going to say this, they're going to say this, back and forth, trying to figure out what, their reaction would be before he ever interacted with them. And I was like, I can't do these mental gymnastics in my head. I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. I'm that kind of person. And, so it was not fair to me that he was, interacting with a version of me that didn't exist. But, I know now that's because the narcs have, 2 sides. They've got the false self and, the real self. And there's an internal conflict with them. But, and so she said, I think that you need to come to therapy on your own. So he went to therapy on his own for a while to deal with the trauma from his childhood. I don't know how much trauma there actually was because, I've been accused of violence towards him and I was never violent towards him. So, he's accused his parents of the same thing. So he went to see her for a while and underwent something called EMDR therapy. And it's supposed to kind of help victims of complex PTSD be able to take, the memories and the flashbacks and, minimize them and put them in the back of their mind or whatever. And the weeks that he was going there, he also was put on Effexor. It's an antidepressant by his doctor. And he started getting weirder and weirder. There was one time that because he was yelling more and more and more, and he was snapping at the kids. And there's one time I'm getting the kids ready for school, and I'm in the kitchen, all of a sudden he just grabs me by the shoulders and he just shakes me as hard as he can, screaming at the top of his lungs, "You will listen to me! This is the gift of listening, and you will listen to me!" I mean, just like that. Scared the crap out of me. Scared the crap out of the kids. They're sitting there like, oh my God, what's going on? And I take the kids to the bus that morning. I come back 2 hours later and, hi, honey, how's your morning? I'm like, oh my God, this man's a psycho. He's gone crazy. And it just got worse and worse. We were buying a house at the time. Our house was for sale. We were buying a new house, and we met with our buyer's agent and the people selling the house. And while we're negotiating, he just starts having a panic attack. He's just like and shaking. It's like, I don't know how we're gonna come up with $5,000 to cover closing costs. And I was like, what? Why are you freaking out? It's like, this is no big deal. It's like, they're not talking about us paying $5,000. They're talking about they're going to cover $5,000 of the closing costs. And our buyer's agent, she's buying it. She's like, it's okay, it's okay. I had a difficult childhood too. And I'm like, what? You've shared your childhood with our buyer's agent? Like, what transpired here? That I didn't know about. And he just gets weirder. He's walking around the house whistling all the time. And I remember reading in Thomas Sheridan's book, Labyrinth the Psychopath, where he talks about, these psychopaths, make weird noises all the time. They're not even aware of them, and they whistle. And, he was whistling all the time, and it was creepy. It wasn't like a whistle, like, a happy whistle. It was almost like a creepy, I'm up to something whistle. And, he was whistling the tune Happy. And he said, this is my new theme song. The song, clap along if you feel like a room without a view. Clap along if you, cause I'm happy, And, I couldn't listen to that song for a long time because it would just creep me out, with how, he was whistling it. But, the night that he tore up our bedroom and, put the gun in his mouth and was going to kill himself, he came home that afternoon. It's like, my counselor says that I'm healed now and we can go back to counseling together. His eyes would be like that. And I'm like, oh my God, if this is her version of he's better, I don't want to know what she thinks when he's worse. And so, of course, that night we got into an argument. He tore up the bedroom. He yanked the mattress off the bed with me in it. He's pounding the mattress as hard as he can. He's, yelling and screaming. And, when I say I'm going to go get the kids and take them to my mom's house, that's when he pulls out the loaded shotgun and puts it in his mouth. And of course, he ended up in the mental hospital for several days, and that's where, he had more therapy, and, this time, there was a bigger audience. He could spin his story that I'm such a victim. I'm the victim of this abusive, horrible marriage, And, I'd been told by his social worker to call his counselor and let her know that he was in the mental hospital. And, I had called my counselor just to let, I'd text her, it was like, hey, my husband tried to kill himself, because at the time I thought he really had tried to kill himself. And, she called me back immediately, like, oh my God, are you okay? What can I do for you? In contrast, his counselor, I called her, I left a message, I texted her multiple times. 3 days later, she calls, oh my God, did you know that he was suicidal? Did you see any signs? And I got so mad, I was like, lady, that's your job. You're the professional. You're the one who was giving him EMDR therapy, and suggesting he go on antidepressants. You should have known that. You should have known whether he was suicidal or not, instead of sending a crazy man home and telling him he's cured. Well, anyways. But what I can say is that, don't ever go to therapy with a narcissist. Don't let them pick the therapist. Don't go to marriage counseling with a narcissist. It's a complete waste of time. It really is. They're on stage. They're going to make you out to be the villain. They're the hero. They're the victim of their story. And, you're just going to waste your money and your time. Well, that's all for now. Be vigilant. Be safe. Take care.